What happens when a peaceful charity event becomes the target of a violent biker gang? In this gripping story, Samuel, a retired Army Ranger, shows us the power of courage and resilience. As the gang tries to spread fear, Samuel steps up to protect the attendees and shut down their hateful agenda. Watch as a quiet hero transforms into an unstoppable force, inspiring a community to stand together against hatred. This story of bravery and justice will leave you on the edge of your seat. Don't miss it. Hit play and join the fight for unity and hope. It was a bright and warm Saturday afternoon in the heart of Willow Creek, a small, tight-knit town surrounded by rolling hills. The town's annual charity event, hosted at the local community center, was in full swing. Families strolled among colorful booths adorned with balloons, handmade banners, and tables covered in baked goods. The laughter of children echoed in the air as they played games, while the aroma of sizzling barbecue wafted through the venue. At the center of the event stood Samuel Hayes, a man in his early 40s with a commanding yet approachable presence. His strong build and calm demeanor hinted at a disciplined past, though he rarely spoke of his time as an Army Ranger. Today, he wore a simple button-up shirt and jeans, blending seamlessly with the crowd as he helped carry boxes of donated items to the auction table. The community event was more than just a fundraiser. It was a celebration of unity and resilience. Months of effort had gone into organizing the event, with proceeds going toward a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth in Willow Creek. Samuel, who had quietly become one of the most respected figures in town since retiring from the military, had played a key role in making it happen. Samuel, a cheerful voice called out. Turning, he saw Maria, a spirited middle-aged woman, and one of the event's coordinators, waving him over. Her clipboard was crammed with notes, and her face was flushed from the heat. We're short on volunteers for the raffle booth. Can you spare a few minutes? Of course, Samuel replied, his deep voice steady and reassuring. He picked up a box of prizes and walked with Maria, exchanging greetings with familiar faces along the way. Nearby, a group of teenagers sat on picnic benches, joking and snapping selfies. Older couples admired handmade crafts displayed by local artisans. The event had drawn a bigger crowd than expected, a sign of the town's enduring spirit. As Samuel reached the raffle booth, he paused to admire the sight. This was why he'd chosen Willow Creek as his home after leaving the military, a place where neighbors knew each other by name, where children could run freely, and where people worked together to create something meaningful. But as Samuel handed out raffle tickets, his sharp instincts noticed something unusual. A few motorbikes rumbled faintly in the distance, the sound barely audible over the music and chatter. His gaze flicked toward the road leading to the event, where a group of bikers was approaching, their loud engines cutting through the peace of the afternoon. Though he didn't let it show, Samuel's senses heightened. His years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about the scene ahead felt wrong. Everything okay, Samuel? Maria asked, noticing the slight shift in his expression. Yeah, he replied calmly, his eyes not leaving the approaching bikers. Just keeping an eye on things. The rumble grew louder, and the mood of the event began to shift ever so slightly. Samuel tightened his grip on the raffle tickets, his mind already calculating what might happen next. The festive atmosphere at the charity event started to fray as the low rumble of motorcycle engines drew closer. Conversation softened, laughter waned, and several attendees turned toward the road where the sound originated. The sight of the gang rolling in, a group of 6 bikers on sleek, black motorcycles, brought a wave of unease that rippled through the crowd. Samuel stood near the raffle booth, his sharp gaze fixed on the newcomers. Each biker wore a matching leather vest adorned with symbols that Samuel immediately recognized as more than rebellious fashion. These were insignias tied to notorious hate groups. Tattoos peeked out from their sleeves, and their hardened expressions made their intentions unmistakable. The gang slowed as they reached the edge of the event, parking their motorcycles in a line that felt more like a barrier than a coincidence. Their leader, a tall man with a shaved head and a jagged scar running across his cheek, swung his leg off the bike and surveyed the crowd with a predatory smirk. Well, he drawled, his voice carrying over the quieting crowd. Looks like we stumbled into a real party. The bikers chuckled darkly as they dismounted, their boots crunching against the gravel. They spread out slightly, their deliberate movements filling the space with an unspoken threat. Children instinctively moved closer to their parents, and adults exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do. Reverend Charles, a kind and soft-spoken man who had helped organize the event, stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady despite the tension, "this is a community event. You're welcome here if you come in peace, but we don't tolerate trouble." The leader cocked his head, his smirk widening. "Trouble? Now why would we bring trouble? We're just here to enjoy the fun, maybe grab a bite, talk to some of the fine folks in town." Samuel's jaw tightened as he watched the exchange. He didn't miss the way one of the bikers deliberately knocked over a table of baked goods as he walked past, or the way another flipped a handmade banner with a sneer. The gang wasn't just here to intimidate. They were here to assert dominance. "Let's go," Samuel murmured to Maria, handing her the rest of the raffle tickets. He moved toward the center of the event, his calm but purposeful strides drawing the attention of several onlookers. The leader noticed him too, his eyes narrowing as Samuel approached. "And who are you supposed to be?" he asked, his tone mocking. "The welcome committee?" Samuel stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his voice firm. "This is a peaceful event. Whatever you're here for, it stops now." The smirk on the leader's face twisted into something darker. "Oh, we'll leave when we're good and ready. You gonna make us?" The air grew heavier, the tension crackling like a live wire. Samuel's expression didn't change, but inside, he braced himself. This was far from over. The bikers' presence cast a dark shadow over the once vibrant charity event. Conversations turned into hushed murmurs as the gang began moving through the crowd. Their deliberate posturing and pointed comments made it clear they weren't here for the food or festivities. One biker grabbed a hot dog off a child's plate without asking, smirking as the boy's eyes widened in shock. "Thanks, kid," he sneered before turning his back. Another ran his finger across a handcrafted quilt on the auction table, lifting the corner as if to inspect it, then letting it fall to the ground with a smirk. Reverend Charles tried to maintain an air of calm, moving quickly to reassure attendees, but it was clear that fear was spreading. "Stay close to the booze," he urged some of the families, his voice low but firm. "We'll get through this." Samuel remained at the center of the activity, his sharp gaze never leaving the gang. He was aware of every movement, cataloging their actions and noting the subtle hierarchy within the group. The leader was clearly the driving force, his every gesture or word prompting the others to follow suit. "Nice little setup you've got here," the leader drawled, walking up to the raffle booth. He picked up a glass jar full of tickets and gave it a shake, the sound of paper rustling grating against the tense silence. "I bet you worked real hard on this." Maria, standing behind the booth, gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Her eyes flicked to Samuel, who gave her a subtle nod of reassurance. "That's enough," Samuel said, stepping closer. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made the leader pause. The leader turned, his smirk returning, as he sized Samuel up. "You've got a lot to say for someone who doesn't know what's good for him." He sneered. "You've made your point," Samuel said evenly. "Leave before this gets worse. For everyone." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the event. "Worse? We haven't even started." His words were a signal. Two of the bikers moved toward the stage, where a local band was setting up. They began knocking over equipment, the crash of cymbals and amps shattering the already fragile sense of security. "Hey!" the lead singer shouted, stepping forward. "You can't do that." One of the bikers shoved him back roughly, sending him stumbling off the stage. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and several people began edging toward the exits. Samuel's fists clenched at his sides, but he remained still, calculating. The gang was trying to provoke fear, to make the community feel powerless. Reacting impulsively would only give them what they wanted. Reverend Charles moved to Samuel's side, his expression filled with worry. "What do we do?" he whispered. "Hold the line," Samuel replied quietly, his voice resolute. But the gang wasn't done. The leader sauntered toward the stage. Picking up a microphone, he tapped it a few times, the sound reverberating through the speakers. "Attention, everyone," he called out, his tone mockingly cheerful. "We're here to remind you who really runs this town. 2 weeks. That's how long you've got to shut this whole operation down. After that, well, accidents happen." Tears welled up in the eyes of a young woman holding her toddler as she clutched him tightly. An elderly man shook his head, muttering prayers under his breath. The crowd was paralyzed, trapped between fear and the desire to protect their families. Samuel's voice cut through the chaos, calm but commanding. "That's enough." The leader looked at him again, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Or what?" he taunted. Samuel took a step forward, his broad frame and steady gaze exuding quiet strength. "Or you'll regret finding out." The leader's smirk faltered for a moment before he laughed again, though it sounded forced. "You've got guts. I'll give you that." He motioned for his men to follow him. "Let's go. Boys, we've made our point." As the gang retreated, the tension in the air didn't ease. Samuel stood in the center of the gathering, his presence the only thing keeping the fragile calm intact. He turned to Maria and Reverend Charles. "This isn't over. They'll be back." The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field. Despite the gang's earlier retreat, the unease lingered like a storm cloud. Volunteers hurried to pack up tables and booths, their hands trembling as they glanced nervously toward the horizon. Samuel stood near the stage, his posture calm but alert, his presence a silent reassurance to those around him. "Samuel," Reverend Charles said, approaching him with a furrowed brow, "we need to call this off. It's too dangerous to continue." Samuel shook his head, his gaze steady. "If we cancel, they'll think they've won. They'll come back bolder. We can't let them believe we're afraid." The Reverend hesitated, his concern evident. "But what if they return tonight? I don't want anyone hurt." "They will," Samuel said simply, his voice low but resolute. "And when they do, we'll be ready." The Reverend studied him for a moment before nodding reluctantly. "I'll make sure everyone stays safe." As darkness fell, the sound of rumbling engines shattered the fragile calm. The gang was back, their motorcycles tearing through the quiet evening like thunder. Headlights pierced the gathering dusk, illuminating the field as the bikers formed a line at the edge of the event. The leader dismounted first, his boots crunching against the gravel as he strode forward. His smirk was gone, replaced by a predatory glare. Behind him, his men fanned out, their movements deliberate and intimidating. Samuel stepped forward to meet them, his broad shoulders blocking their view of the frightened crowd behind him. "This isn't the place for you," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the field. The leader sneered. "We gave you a warning. Old man, 2 weeks to pack up and leave. Seems like you didn't listen." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "We're not going anywhere. This event is about the community, and you won't ruin it." The gang laughed, the sound hollow and cruel. One biker stepped closer, a sneer twisting his face. "You think you can stop us? You're just one man." Samuel's eyes flicked to the biker, his calm exterior unshaken. "One man is all it takes." The tension snapped like a taut wire. The leader gestured sharply, and the bikers surged forward, their boots pounding against the ground as they closed the distance. The crowd gasped, some scattering toward the exits while others froze in place. But Samuel was ready. As the first biker lunged at him, Samuel sidestepped with precision honed by years of military training. He grabbed the man's arm, twisting it sharply and sending him sprawling to the ground with a pained grunt. Another came at him from the side, swinging a makeshift weapon. Samuel ducked, delivering a sharp elbow to the biker's ribs and following up with a sweep of his leg. The man hit the ground hard, his weapon clattering away. The leader watched, his expression shifting from smug confidence to simmering anger. "Get him," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. 2 more bikers charged, their movements reckless in their desperation. Samuel moved like a coiled spring, disarming one with a swift twist of his wrist and using the man's momentum to throw him into the other. Both crumpled in a heap, groaning in pain. "Stop!" a voice rang out. Maria stood near the stage, her voice trembling but resolute. "This is a charity event. Leave us alone." The leader turned his glare on her, his lips curling into a snarl. You think your little speech will stop us? Sweetheart, Samuel stepped between them, his presence a wall of protection. You've already lost, he said, his voice low and deliberate. The leader lunged at him, swinging wildly. Samuel blocked the blow effortlessly, countering with a precise strike that sent the leader staggering. The crowd, emboldened by Samuel's defiance, began shouting in support. "Get out of here," one man yelled, shaking his fist. "We're not afraid of you." The bikers hesitated, their bravado cracking as they saw their leader struggling against the unrelenting force of Samuel's defense. One by one, they began to back away, their confidence evaporating under the weight of the crowd's growing defiance. The leader glared at Samuel, clutching his side as he stumbled toward his bike. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice laced with venom. Samuel didn't flinch. "Yes, it is," he said, his tone final. As the gang mounted their bikes and roared away into the night, the crowd erupted into cheers. Tears streamed down Maria's face as she ran to Samuel, embracing him tightly. "You saved us," she whispered. Samuel shook his head. "We saved each other," he said, looking out over the crowd. The danger had passed, but Samuel knew the fight wasn't over. There were still consequences to face, justice to pursue, and a community to rebuild. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the cheers of the crowd. Flashing red and blue lights appeared on the horizon, casting streaks of light across the now silent field. The police cars rolled in, their tires crunching against the gravel, signaling the arrival of law enforcement at last. Samuel stood near the stage, his posture steady despite the exhaustion settling into his muscles. His sharp eyes tracked the movement of the officers as they stepped out of their vehicles, their hands hovering cautiously near their holsters. "Who's in charge here?" asked a tall officer with a stern expression, his gaze sweeping over the gathering crowd. Reverend Charles stepped forward, his hands raised slightly in a calming gesture. "That would be me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is a charity event, and we were attacked by a gang." The officer's brow furrowed. "Attacked? Are the suspects still here?" "No," Samuel interjected, stepping forward. "They fled when they realized they couldn't intimidate us. But they'll be back if we don't act quickly." The officer's eyes shifted to Samuel, his expression skeptical. "And you are?" "Samuel Hayes," he replied, meeting the officer's gaze without hesitation. "Former Army Ranger. I defended the event when the gang tried to cause harm." Another officer approached, nodding toward a few members of the crowd who were holding up their phones. "We've got witnesses with video footage," she said, glancing between Samuel and Reverend Charles. The Reverend gestured toward Maria, who stood nearby clutching her phone. "Maria can show you what happened. She recorded the entire thing." Maria stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over her phone. "They came here to threaten us," she explained, her voice quivering but resolute. "They said they wanted us gone." Samuel stopped them. The tall officer reviewed the video, his jaw tightening as the footage played. It captured everything: the gang's initial threats, their violent escalation, and Samuel's decisive defense. When the video ended, he exhaled sharply, his gaze softening slightly as he looked at Samuel. "Well, Mr. Hayes," he said, "it seems you saved a lot of people tonight." Samuel's expression didn't change. "Saving them isn't enough. That gang is still out there, and they're not done. You need to act before they come back with something worse." The officer nodded. "We'll take this seriously. I'll put out an APB on the suspects and forward the footage to our investigation unit." "Good," Samuel said, his voice firm. "But this can't just end here. They've been terrorizing this town for too long." The officer hesitated before replying. "We'll do our best, but we're stretched thin as it is." Samuel's jaw tightened. He wanted to push further, but knew it wasn't the time. Instead, he nodded and stepped back, allowing the officers to speak with other witnesses. As the police began their investigation, the crowd slowly dispersed. Reverend Charles approached Samuel, his expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You've done more for us tonight than we could ever thank you for," he said quietly. Samuel shook his head. "This isn't over yet, Reverend. They'll come back if they think they can get away with it. We need to make sure they can't." The the Reverend placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "And we will." Together, the sirens faded into the distance as the officers drove away, their promise of action lingering in the air. For the first time that night, the field was quiet, but Samuel knew the real battle had just begun. By the following morning, the charity event and its dramatic showdown had become the town's biggest story, and it wasn't stopping there. Videos of the confrontation, particularly Samuel's commanding defense against the gang, had gone viral overnight. News anchors from local stations picked up the story, broadcasting headlines like "Former Army Ranger fends off violent gang at charity event" and "Hero stops attack, protects community." Samuel stood by his kitchen window, the morning sunlight streaming in as he sipped his coffee. The hum of the television filled the background, playing one of the many reports featuring the footage. His name was now public knowledge, and with it came a flood of attention he wasn't entirely comfortable with. On the screen, a local reporter stood outside the charity's field, her tone urgent. Witnesses described Samuel Hayes as a hero. His quick thinking and combat training are credited with saving dozens of lives last night. Here's what some attendees had to say. The video cut to Maria, her face earnest despite her nerves. "When the gang showed up, we were all terrified. They threatened us, knocked things over. They weren't going to stop." But Samuel didn't hesitate. He put himself between us and them. "I don't even want to think about what could have happened if he hadn't been there." Another clip showed Reverend Charles speaking passionately. "This community owes Samuel Hayes a debt of gratitude. He not only defended us physically, but reminded us that we can stand up against fear and hatred. He's an inspiration to all of us." Samuel sighed, turning the volume down. He didn't want the focus to be on him. The real story was the community's resilience, not one man's actions. Still, he couldn't deny that the attention had already begun to make an impact. The phone on the counter buzzed, and Samuel glanced at the screen. Another unknown number. Over the past 12 hours, calls and texts from reporters, concerned citizens, and even former military comrades had flooded his phone. He let it go to voicemail, shaking his head. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Opening it, he found Reverend Charles and Maria standing on his porch, their expressions a mix of urgency and excitement. "Samuel," the Reverend began, stepping inside. "Have you seen the news? It's everywhere." "I've seen it," Samuel replied, closing the door behind them. "I just don't know if this is the kind of attention we need." Maria shook her head. "You're wrong. People need to see this. They need to know what's happening here and what people like that gang are capable of. You're showing them that they can fight back." Samuel crossed his arms. "It's not about fighting. It's about standing together, showing them that we won't be intimidated. That's exactly why this matters." Reverend Charles said, "Because you stood up, others will feel like they can, too. You've started something, Samuel, whether you meant to or not." Samuel frowned but nodded. He knew they were right, even if the attention made him uneasy. Later that day, Samuel reluctantly agreed to an interview with a local station. Sitting across from the reporter, he made one thing clear. This wasn't about being a hero. It was about protecting people. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their community, and no one has the right to take that away. The segment aired that evening, and Samuel's words struck a chord. Messages of support began pouring in from across the country. People shared stories of their own encounters with hate and intimidation, expressing gratitude for Samuel's courage. Online, hashtags like #StandWithSamuel and #ResistHate trended, amplifying the story's reach. Organizations dedicated to combating hate crimes reached out to collaborate, and national media outlets requested interviews. Samuel remained grounded, focusing on the message rather than the fame. In one follow-up interview, he said, "This isn't over. What happened at the charity event was just one fight. The real battle is ensuring these groups don't thrive. It's about building stronger communities together." As the media frenzy continued, Samuel's quiet strength and humility became a symbol of hope. He hadn't sought the spotlight, but his actions had illuminated a path forward for many. In the days following the event, the town of Green Valley found itself at the center of a national conversation. News coverage of the gang's attack and Samuel's heroic intervention had not only highlighted the immediate danger, but also brought attention to broader issues of community safety and resilience. For many residents, the incident served as a wake-up call, one that spurred reflection and action. Samuel sat in a packed town hall meeting, the hum of quiet conversation filling the room as neighbors, community leaders, and local officials gathered to discuss the next steps. The atmosphere was heavy with determination, but also a sense of unity that hadn't been felt in years. Reverend Charles stood at the front, addressing the crowd. "We can't ignore what happened here. Last week, we faced hatred head-on, but we stood together. Now, it's time to make sure we're prepared for whatever comes next." Applause rippled through the room as heads nodded in agreement. Samuel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, observing the scene. He had been hesitant to attend, preferring to let the community take the reins. But Reverend Charles had insisted. "Samuel," the Reverend said, gesturing toward him, "I think I speak for everyone when I say we owe you a debt of gratitude. You didn't just protect us. You showed us what courage looks like." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Samuel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Standing, he cleared his throat. "I appreciate the kind words," he began, his voice steady. "But the truth is, I didn't do this alone. The real strength is right here, in this room. It's in people like Maria, who stood firm when fear tried to take over. It's in every one of you who refused to let hatred win." The applause grew louder, and Samuel continued, his tone more urgent. "What happened last week was a warning. These groups thrive on intimidation, and they target communities they think won't fight back. We proved them wrong, but we can't stop here. We need to make sure no one else in Green Valley or anywhere else has to go through this." The conversation shifted to practical measures. Maria proposed forming a community watch group, with volunteers taking turns monitoring public events and spaces. "It's not about confrontation," she explained. "It's about being vigilant and creating a presence that says, 'We see you, and we won't tolerate hate.'" Local officials committed to increasing police patrols and working more closely with federal agencies to monitor potential threats. Reverend Charles announced plans to host a series of workshops on conflict resolution and de-escalation, inviting experts to teach the community how to stay safe and united in the face of intimidation. But it wasn't just about defense. Green Valley's residents wanted to build something stronger, something rooted in understanding and inclusion. Samuel suggested organizing an annual Day of Unity, where people from all backgrounds could come together to celebrate their shared values. "I've seen what division can do," Samuel said, his voice firm. "It tears people apart, but events like this remind us that we're stronger together. That's the best way to fight back, by showing the world what a united community looks like." The idea was met with enthusiasm, and planning for the first Day of Unity began immediately. Local businesses offered to sponsor food and activities, while volunteers signed up to spread the word. As the meeting drew to a close, Samuel felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The fight wasn't over, but the community was no longer passive. They had found their voice, and they were using it to create something lasting. Outside the town hall, Samuel and Reverend Charles stood together, watching as people filed out with renewed purpose. "You did more than just protect us that night," the Reverend said, his tone thoughtful. "You gave us the courage to protect ourselves." Samuel nodded, his gaze steady. "This is what matters. Building something better. Together." Months after the attack at the charity event, the ripples of Samuel's actions were still being felt far beyond Green Valley. His story had captured the nation's attention, becoming a symbol of resilience, unity, and the power of individual action. News outlets shared his story widely, framing him as an unlikely hero who turned a moment of fear into a catalyst for change. But for Samuel, the most meaningful impact wasn't the headlines or interviews. It was the countless messages he received from strangers. Letters poured in from all over the country. A teenager in Chicago who decided to start a community support group. A retired teacher in Alabama inspired to mentor at-risk youth. And even veterans who shared their own struggles and triumphs after returning to civilian life. Samuel kept a small box on his kitchen table, filled with these letters. On quiet evenings, he'd read through them, each one a reminder of why he had chosen to step up that day. Green Valley's first day of unity was fast approaching, and Samuel had reluctantly agreed to deliver the keynote speech. Standing on the stage, he scanned the crowd, a sea of faces representing every corner of the community. Families with children, elderly couples, young activists, all gathered to celebrate what they had built together. Taking a deep breath, Samuel began. When I came to Green Valley, I didn't expect to find myself at the center of something like this. Like many of you, I just wanted to live quietly and give back when I could. But that night, at the charity event, something became very clear to me. Hate thrives in silence. It depends on people staying quiet, staying scared, and that's why standing up together is so powerful. He paused, letting his words sink in. I didn't stop that gang alone. Maria didn't stand up alone. Reverend Charles didn't rally this community alone. And today, looking out at all of you, I know that what we built here wasn't done alone. This is what happens when people refuse to let fear divide them. This is what happens when we choose courage over silence. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the park. Samuel stepped back from the podium, his heart full as he watched neighbors embrace. Children laugh, and volunteers hand out flyers for new initiatives. The event's success marked a turning point for the town. Donations poured in to support local programs, including the Community Watch Group and workshops in conflict resolution. Other towns began reaching out to learn how Green Valley had mobilized so effectively, using the town as a model for their own efforts. For Samuel, the most rewarding moments were quieter. A young boy approached him after the speech, clutching a hand-drawn card. "My mom said you're a hero," the boy said shyly. "I want to be brave like you." Samuel knelt, accepting the card with a warm smile. "You already are brave. Kid, don't forget that." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Samuel stood on the edge of the park, watching the community he'd grown to love thrive in the glow of unity. His role might have been small, but its impact would last for generations.